Hi, boys and girls. This is Mr. Chalfant, and we are on Chapter 8 in our story called Dance at Grandpa's. And if you remember, at the end of the last chapter, they had the sugar snow, which was the time at the end of the winter, right at the beginning of spring, when the maple trees had the sap running up and down, and Grandpa was able to collect all of the maple syrup. And he said that they were going to do this again in a few weeks. And so everybody, all of the friends and family, were going to be invited to a dance at Grandpa's. And that's this chapter. So some of the questions I want you guys to be thinking about when you're reading are, who was actually at the dance? Like, who all got invited to the dance at Grandpa's? And what was it that Grandpa brought in for everybody to enjoy? And then Laura, you can see Laura and another little girl arguing about something there. What were they arguing about? So pay attention to that. What did Pa and Ma do at the dance? And then think about a time that you've been with family and friends at a big festival where everybody was together, and think about what that was like. And what was maybe a favorite time that you've done something like that? So try to make a text to self connection as we're reading this. So we're going to go ahead and read the story. So follow along. Monday morning, everybody got up early in a hurry to get started to Grandpa's. Pa wanted to be there to help with the work of gathering and boiling the sap. Ma would help Grandma and the aunts make good things to eat for all the people who were coming to the dance. Breakfast was eaten and the dishes washed and the beds made by lamplight, so it must be very early in the morning. Pa packed his fiddle carefully in its box and put it in the big sled that was already waiting at the gate. The air was cold and frosty, and the light was gray when Laura and Mary and Ma with baby Carrie were tucked in snug and warm under the robes on the straw in the bottom of the sled. The horses shook their heads and pranced, making the sleigh bells ring merrily, and away they went on the road through the big woods to Grandpa's. The snow was damp and smooth in the road, so the sled slipped quickly over it, and the big trees seemed to be hurrying by on either side. After a while, there was sunshine in the woods, and the air sparkled. The long streaks of yellow light lay between the shadows of the tree trunks, and the snow was colored faintly pink. Boys and girls, you've seen that before when, like either at sunrise or sunset, maybe the colors look a little bit different. All the shadows were thin and blue, and every little curve of snowdrifts and every little track in the snow had a shadow. Pa showed Laura the tracks of the wild creatures in the snow at the sides of the road. The small, leaping tracks of cottontail rabbits, the tiny tracks of field mice, and the feather-stitching tracks of snowbirds. There were larger tracks, like dogs' tracks, where foxes had run, and there were the tracks of a deer that had bounded away into the woods. The air was growing warmer already, and Pa said that the snow wouldn't last long. It did not seem long until they were sweeping into the clearing at Grandpa's house, all the sleigh bells jingling. Grandma came to the door and stood there smiling, calling to them to come in. I bet you've been to Grandma or Grandpa's house or someone in your family and they were excited to see you, just like that. She said that Grandpa and Uncle George were already at work out in the maple woods. So Pa went to help them while Laura and Mary and Ma, with baby Carrie in her arms, went into Grandma's house and took off their wraps. Laura loved Grandma's house. It was much larger than their house at home. There was one great big room, and then there was a little room that belonged to Uncle George, and there was another room for the aunts, Aunt Docia and Aunt Ruby, and then there was the kitchen with a big cook stove. It was fun to run the whole length of the big room, from the large fireplace at one end all the way to Grandma's bed under the window in the other end. The floor was made of wide, thick slabs that Grandpa had hewed, that means he had cut them, from the logs with his axe. The floor was smoothed all over and scrubbed clean and white, and the big bed under the window was soft with feathers. The day seemed very short, while Laura and Mary played in the big room, and Ma helped Grandma and the aunts in the kitchen. The men had taken their dinners to the maple woods, So for dinner, they did not set the table. Boys and girls, when they say dinner here, I think what they really mean is what we would call lunch. They think of breakfast and then dinner and then supper is what they would have, and that's what we call dinner. Okay, so sometimes they use some different words. They ate cold venison sandwiches and drank milk. But for supper, there it is, but for supper, Grandma made hasty pudding. She stood by the stove, sifting the yellow cornmeal from her fingers into a kettle of boiling salted water. She stirred the water all the time with a big wooden spoon and sifted in the meal until the kettle was full of a thick, yellow, bubbling mass. Then she set it on the back of the stove where it would cook slowly. You might have something that you really like to watch a grandma or grandpa or someone in your family cook, maybe mom or dad. It smelled so good. The whole house smelled good with the sweet and spicy smells from the kitchen, the smell of the hickory logs burning with clear, bright flames in the fireplace, and the smell of a clove apple beside Grandma's mending basket on the table. The sunshine came in through the sparkling window panes, and everything was large and spacious and clean. At supper time, Pa and Grandpa came from the woods. Each had on his shoulders a wooden yoke that Grandpa had made. You can see a picture right there. That yoke goes on his neck, and he can carry something that's very heavy because he's not carrying it just with his arms, he's carrying it with his whole body. It was cut to fit around the necks and the back, and hollowed out to fit over the shoulders. From each end hung a chain with a hook, and on each hook hung a big wooden bucket full of, what do you think? Remember the syrup? It was full of hot maple syrup. Pa and Grandpa had brought the syrup from the big kettle in the woods. They steadied the buckets with their hands, but the weight hung from the yokes on their shoulders. Grandma made room for a huge brass kettle on the stove. Pa and Grandpa poured the syrup into the brass kettle, and it was so large that it held all the syrup from the 4 buckets. Then Uncle George came with a smaller bucket of syrup, and everybody ate the hot, hasty pudding with maple syrup for supper. Uncle George was home from the army. Can you see Uncle George there? He's the one playing the bugle. Uncle George was home from the army. He wore his blue army coat with the big brass buttons, and he had bold, merry blue eyes. He was big and broad, and he walked with a swagger. Laura looked at him all the time that she was eating her hasty pudding, because she had heard Pa say to Ma that he was wild. George is wild since he came back from the war, Pa had said, shaking his head as if he were sorry, but it couldn't be helped. Uncle George had run away to be a drummer boy in the army when he was 14 years old. Laura had never seen a wild man before. She did not know whether she was afraid of Uncle George or not. When supper was over, Uncle George went outside the door and blew his army bugle, long and loud. It made a lovely ringing sound, far away through the big woods. The woods were dark and silent, and the trees stood still as though they were listening. Then, from very far away, the sound came back, thin and clear and small, like a little bugle answering the big one. "Listen," Uncle George said. "Isn't that pretty?" Laura looked at him, but she did not say anything. And when Uncle George stopped blowing the bugle, she ran into the house. Ma and Grandma cleared away the dishes and washed them and swept the hearth, while Aunt Docia and Aunt Ruby made themselves pretty in their room. Laura sat on their bed and watched them comb out their long hair and part it carefully. They parted it from their foreheads to the napes of their necks, and then they parted it across from ear to ear. They braided their back hair in long braids, and then they did the braids up carefully in big knots. They had washed their hands and faces and scrubbed them well with soap at the wash basin on the bench in the kitchen. They had used store soap, not the slimy, soft, dark brown soap that Grandma made and kept in a big jar to use for every day. They fussed for a long time with their front hair, holding up the lamp and looking at their hair in the little looking glass. That's the mirror that hung on the log wall, and you can see them getting themselves ready in that picture right there. They brushed it so smooth on each side of the straight white part that it shone like silk in the lamplight. The little puff on each side shone too, and the ends were coiled and twisted neatly under the big knot in their back. Then they pulled on their beautiful white stockings that they had knit of fine cotton thread in lacy openwork patterns, and they buttoned up their best shoes. They helped each other with their corsets. That's something that women wore back in those times um, to kind of make themselves look smaller around the middle. Aunt Docia pulled as hard as she could on Aunt Ruby's corset strings, and then Aunt Docia hung onto the foot of the bed while Aunt Ruby pulled on hers. "Pull, Ruby, pull," Aunt Docia said, breathless. "Pull harder." So Aunt Ruby braced her feet and pulled harder. Aunt Docia kept measuring her waist with her hands, and at last she gasped, "I guess that's the best you can do." She said, "Caroline says Charles could span her waist with his hands when they were married." Caroline was Laura's ma, and when she heard this, Laura felt proud. Then Aunt Ruby and Aunt Docia put on their flannel petticoats and their plain petticoats and their stiff, starched white petticoats with knitted lace all around the flounces, and then they put on their beautiful dresses. In other words, they got themselves all ready. And you can see the dresses are pretty fancy with all the puffs at the bottom. That's kind of the way that they dressed back in those days. Aunt Docia's dress was a sprigged print, dark blue with little red flowers and green leaves thick upon it. The basque was buttoned down the front with black buttons, which looked so exactly like juicy big blackberries that Laura wanted to taste them. Aunt Ruby's dress was a wine-colored calico, covered all over with a feathery pattern in lighter wine color. It buttoned with gold-colored buttons, and every button had a little castle and a tree carved on it. You can see how special these dresses are. Aunt Docia's pretty white collar was fastened in front with a large round cameo pin, which had a lady's head on it, but Aunt Ruby pinned her collar with a red rose made of sealing wax. She had made it herself on the head of a darning needle which had a broken eye, so it couldn't be used as a needle anymore. They looked lovely, sailing over the floor so smoothly with their large round skirts. Their little waists rose up tight and slender in the middle, and their cheeks were red and their eyes were bright under the wings of shining sleek hair. But Ma was beautiful too in her dark green dress with the little leaves that looked like strawberries scattered over it. The skirt was ruffled and flounced and draped and trimmed with knots of dark green ribbon, and nestling at her throat was a gold pin. The pin was flat, as long and as wide as Laura's two biggest fingers, and it was carved all over and scalloped on the edges. Ma looked so rich and fine that Laura was afraid to touch her. People had begun to come. They were coming on foot through the snowy woods with their lanterns, and they were driving up to the door in sleds and in wagons. Sleigh bells were jingling all the time. So, what was it that Uncle George had done when he blew that bugle? What do you think he'd done? He basically let all of the neighbors know that it was time to come to the dance. The big room filled with tall boots and swishing skirts, and ever so many babies were lying in rows on Grandma's bed. Can you see all the babies there? All those babies are ready to go to sleep because it's nighttime. It's getting to be nighttime, and they're taking their nighttime nap. Uncle James and Aunt Libby had come with their little girl, whose name was Laura Ingalls, too. Huh. So this is somebody who has the same last name, and their baby girl is named Laura, too. The two Lauras leaned on the bed and looked at the babies, and the other Laura said her baby was prettier than baby Carrie. "She is not either," Laura said. "Carrie's the prettiest baby in the whole world." "No, she isn't," the other Laura said. "Yes, she is." "No, she isn't." Ma came sailing over in her fine dress and said, "Laura." So neither Laura said anything any more. Uncle George was blowing his bugle. It made a loud ringing sound in the big room, and Uncle George joked and laughed and danced, blowing his bugle. And then Pa took his fiddle out of its box, and he began to play, and all of the couples stood in squares on the floor, and they began to dance when Pa called out the figures. Boys and girls, this is a kind of dancing called square dancing, and maybe I'll see if I can find a link to put in there so you guys can see what it sounds like. Basically, the fiddler fiddles or he plays, but he also calls out different steps that the dancers are supposed to do. And it's a really fun way to do a group dance. Grand right and left, Paul called out, and all the skirts began to swirl and the boots began to stamp. The circles went round and round, and the skirts going one way and the boots going the other way, and hands clasping and parting high up in the air. Swing your partners, Pa called, and each gent bow to the lady on the left. They all did just as Pa said. Laura watched Ma's skirt swaying and her little waist bending and her dark head bowing, and she thought that Ma was the loveliest dancer in the world, and the fiddle was playing fine. All the little circles and the big circles went round and around, and the skirts swirled and the boots stamped, and the partners bowed and separated and met and bowed again. In the kitchen, Grandma was all by herself, stirring the boiling syrup in the big brass kettle. She stirred in time to the music, and by the back door was a pail of clean snow, and sometimes Grandma took a spoonful of syrup from the kettle and poured it on some of the snow in a saucer. Do you remember what they did with the sugar snow and how they poured some of the syrup on the snow and it made little candies that they kept? Kind of like the same thing. Laura watched the dancers again. Pa was playing a song called The Irish Washerwoman now. He called out, "Dosey, ladies, dosey do, come down heavy on your heel and toe." Laura could not keep her feet still. Uncle George looked at her and laughed. Then he caught her by the hand and did a little dance with her in the corner. Now she liked Uncle George. Everybody was laughing over by the kitchen door. They were dragging Grandma in from the kitchen. Grandma's dress was beautiful, too, a dark blue calico with autumn-colored leaves scattered over it. Her cheeks were pink from laughing, and she was shaking her head. The wooden spoon was still in her hand, and you can see everybody dancing while Pa's playing there. "I can't leave the syrup," she said. But Pa began to play, the Arkansas Traveler, and everybody began to clap in time to the music. So Grandma bowed to them all and did a few steps by herself. She could dance as prettily as any of them. The clapping almost drowned out the music of Pa's fiddle. Suddenly, Uncle George did a pigeon wing, and bowing low before Grandma, he began to jig. Grandma tossed her spoon to somebody, she put her hands on her hips and faced Uncle George, and everybody shouted. Grandma was dancing with Uncle George. Laura clapped her hands in time to the music with all of the other clapping hands. The fiddle sang as it had never sung before. Grandma's eyes were snapping and her cheeks were red, and underneath her skirts her heels were clicking as fast as the thumping of Uncle George's boots. They're kind of having a little competition with their dancing. Everybody was excited. Uncle George kept on jigging, and Grandma kept on facing him, jigging too. The fiddle didn't stop. Uncle George began to breathe loudly, and he wiped sweat off of his forehead. Grandma's eyes twinkled. "You can't beat her, George," somebody shouted. Uncle George jigged faster. He jigged twice as fast as he had been jigging before. So did Grandma. Everybody cheered again. All the women were laughing and clapping their hands, and the men were teasing George. But George didn't care. He did not have breath enough to laugh. He was jigging as hard as he could. Pa's blue eyes were snapping and sparkling. He was standing up watching George and Grandma, and the bow danced over the fiddle strings. Laura jumped up and down and squealed and clapped her hands. Grandma kept right on jigging. Her hands were on her hips and her chin was up, and she was smiling. George kept right on too, but his boots did not thump as loudly as they had thumped at first. I think he's getting tired. Grandma's heels kept on clickety-clacking happily. A drop of sweat dripped off of George's forehead and shone on his cheek. All at once he threw up his arms and he gasped, "I'm beat!" And he stopped dancing. Everybody made a terrific noise, shouting and yelling and stamping, cheering Grandma. Grandma jigged just a little minute more, and then she stopped. She laughed in big laughs. Her eyes sparkled just like Pa's when he laughed. George was laughing too, and wiping his forehead on his sleeve. Suddenly, Grandma stopped laughing. She turned and ran as fast as she could into the kitchen. The fiddle had stopped playing. All the women were talking at once, and all the men were teasing George. But everybody was still for a minute when Grandma looked like that. What did she forget about while she was dancing? Do you remember? She had been stirring the syrup. and she's forgotten about it now that she had that little dance competition with Uncle George. But now she remembered. Then she came to the door between the kitchen and the big room and said, "The syrup is waxing. Come and help yourselves." So she's boiled off enough of the water that now they can come and enjoy some of the syrup with the snow. Everybody began to talk and laugh again. They all hurried to the kitchen for plates, and outdoors to fill the plates with snow. The kitchen door was open and the cold air came in. So they've got hot maple syrup and they've got the cold ice from the snow. And when they put all of that together, the ice from the snow will harden that sugar, the maple syrup, and it turn it into like a nice little hard candy. I've actually done that before, and it's a lot of fun. Outdoors, the stars were frosty in the sky, and the air nipped Laura's cheeks and nose. Her breath was just like smoke. She and the other Laura and all of the other children scooped up clean snow with their plates. Then they went back into the crowded kitchen. Grandma stood by the brass kettle, and with the big wooden spoon, she poured hot syrup on each plate of snow. It cooled into soft candy, and as fast as it cooled, they ate it. They could eat all that they wanted because maple sugar never hurt anybody. There was plenty of syrup in the kettle, and of course, plenty of snow outdoors. As soon as they ate one plateful, they just filled their plates with snow again, and Grandma poured more syrup on it. When they had eaten the soft maple candy until they could eat no more, they then helped themselves from the long table loaded with pumpkin pies and dried berry pies and cakes and cookies. There was salt rising bread and cold boiled pork and pickles. Can you see that big table there with everything on it? How sour the pickles were. They all ate until they could hold no more, and then they began to dance again. But Grandma watched the syrup in the kettle. Many times she took a little bit out of it and onto a saucer and stirred it round and around, and then she shook her head and poured the syrup back into the kettle. The other room was loud and merry with the music of the fiddle and the noise of the dancing. At last, just as Grandma was stirring, the syrup in the saucer turned into little grains like sand, and Grandma called out, "Quick, girls, it's graining." Aunt Ruby and Aunt Docy and Ma left the dance and came running. They set out pans, big pans and little sand pans, and as fast as Grandma filled them with the syrup, they set out more. They set the filled ones away to cool into maple sugar. Do you remember how they had made maple sugar as well? Grandpa had done that before. So they're going to save the rest of the maple syrup for sugar that they can use all year. Then Grandma said, "Now, bring the patty pans for the children." There was a patty pan, or at least a broken cup or a saucer for every little girl and boy. So just like a little cup or a little saucer for each of the kids. They all watched anxiously while Grandma ladled out the syrup. Perhaps there wouldn't be enough for everybody. Then somebody would have to be unselfish and polite and share. But there was just enough syrup to go around. The last scrapings of the brass kettle exactly filled the very last patty pan for the kids, and nobody was left out. The fiddling and the dancing went on and on. Laura and the other Laura stood around and watched all of the dancers. Then they sat down on the floor in a corner and they watched. The dancing was so pretty and the music was so happy that Laura knew that she would never get tired of it. All of the beautiful skirts were swirling by, and the boots were stamping, and the fiddle kept on singing. But then, the next thing she knew, Laura woke up, and she was lying across the foot of Grandma's bed. It was morning time. Ma and Grandma and baby Carrie were in the bed, and Pa and Grandpa were sleeping rolled up in blankets on the floor by the fireplace, and Mary was nowhere in sight. She was sleeping with Aunt Docy and Aunt Ruby in their bed. And soon everybody was getting up. There were pancakes and maple syrup for breakfast, and then Pa brought the horses and sled to the door. So Laura had just fallen asleep right in the middle of the party, and somehow somebody had carried her to bed. Pa helped Ma and Carrie into the sled, while Grandpa picked up Mary and Uncle George picked up Laura, and they tossed them over the edge of the sled into the straw. Pa tucked in the robes around them, and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle George stood calling, "Goodbye, goodbye," as they rode away into the big woods, finally going home. The sun was warm, and the trotting horses threw up bits of muddy snow with their hoofs. Behind the sled, Laura could see their footprints, and every footprint had gone through the thin snow right into the mud. Before nighttime comes, Pa said, we'll see the last of the sugar snow. And boys and girls, that is our last of that chapter. So they had a great time at Grandpa's house. And I want you guys to think about a time too that you had a fun time with family and friends when, as a child that you've been. So the next chapter is called Going to Town. And if you remember, Laura has never seen a town before. She's never seen two houses next to each other. So the next chapter we'll read tomorrow. So that's all for now.